Chapter 4, Dumbass.
What?
Dumbass. I took a seat. Took a seat. Take a seat. Take a seat. Take a look. Take a walk. 뭐 이런 거 있지? I took a seat in the lunchroom next to Ryan and Michael. Ryan stuck 2 of my carrot sticks in his nose. And I told him I'd give him a nickel if he ate them.
nickel?
따라와.
이거 콧구멍에 이렇게 했는데 이걸 먹으면 니클은 돈도 아니에요.
되게 작은 단위야. He did to me. I won't even eat carrot sticks before you stick them in your nose. 코에 넣기 전에 다 먹을 거야. Do you think that guy was really George Washington? George Washington, Ryan asked. I don't know, Michael said. What do you think, AJ? That's when Andrea Young leaned over from the next table and opened her big mouth. That wasn't George Washington, you dumbass, she said. That was Mrs. Roopy wearing a powdered wig and an army uniform. That was Mrs. Roopy.
왜 파우더는 그거 아닌가?
파우더.
왜 파우더는 가루 아니야? 왜 파우더인지 알아요?
몰라요?
나도 몰라요.
She may have been right, but I didn't want to admit it. She may have been right, but I didn't want to admit it. Because I hate her. Ryan took out a dollar bill from his backpack and looked at the picture of George Washington. He sure looked like George Washington. Ryan said, George Washington has been dead for like 100 years. Even if George Washington was still alive, Emily said, I'm sure he would have more important things to do than come to our school and read us stories. Makes sense. That's when it hit me. If that army guy was really Mrs. Roopy dressed up as George Washington, maybe Mrs. Roopy isn't a librarian at all. Maybe she's just pretending to be a librarian. I said, pretend. I said, just like she was pretending to be George Washington. Yeah, Michael said. Yeah, 너 아니다, 그치?
Yeah.
Maybe she's a kidnapper. Again, kidnapper, and she's got our real librarian locked up in an empty warehouse at the edge of town. I saw that in a movie once. We've got to save her, Emily said with tears dribbling down her cheeks. Then she went running out of the room. There was only one way to solve the problem. We cleaned off our trays and went back to our classroom to ask Miss Daisy if George Washington was really Mrs. Roopy in disguise. 기억날까? Genius in disguise. 우리 봤잖아?
네. Loopy.
변장하단 말이야 이거. Washington was really Mrs. Roopy in disguise. Don't be silly, Miss Daisy said. As it turns out, Mrs. Roopy is absent today. She's home sick, in bed. It must have been real. It must have been the real George Washington. But what does Miss Daisy know? Everybody knows Miss Daisy is crazy. Crazy. 5분밖에 안 됐어. Mrs. Roopy is a hero.
Everybody in our class was excited before the next library period. We all wanted to see if George Washington would be there again. When we got to the library, there was just this lady who looked a little bit like George Washington, except she didn't have on an army uniform or a wig. She looked like a normal lady. Good morning, second graders, she said. My name is Mrs. Roopy. I'm sorry I couldn't be here the other day for your library period. But you were here. Ryan shouted. You must be
George Washington 알겠어? 아, 이 쌤이 하는 말이구나. 애가 하는 줄 알았다. You must be mistaken, Mrs. Roopy said. I was homesick in bed. Can we see your wooden teeth again? Michael asked. Yeah, can we? Wooden teeth? Did you know that George Washington didn't have wooden teeth at all? His mouth was filled with cow's teeth. Ooh, we all shouted.
Ew.
Ew, ew. I asked Mrs. Roopy, did the cow have George Washington's teeth in her mouth?
Huh?
But that was you, wasn't it? Acting like George Washington, said Michael. Mrs. Roopy's forehead got all wrinkly, just like George Washington's did. When we told him about computers, I don't know what you're talking about. We all looked at one another. I wasn't sure if she was telling the truth or not. If I were George Washington, would I have this
Tattoo.
Mrs. Roopy asked. Then she picked up her shirt and showed us her belly. She had a little tattoo. 옛날에 tattoo라고 읽었잖아. Tattoo of a heart right over her belly button. Was cool. I had to admit that George Washington would never have a heart-shaped tattoo over his belly button. So maybe that army guy with the wig wasn't Mrs. Roopy after all. Let me show you around the library. Mrs. Roopy said, did you know that books can take you to places you have never been before? 좋은 문장이다, 그치? Did you know that books can take you to places you have never been before? 무슨 뜻일까요, 이 문장?
너는 책이 너를 다른 세상으로 가게 해줄 수 있는 거라니?
다른 세상 좋은 의역이었는데 You've never been before.
너가 가지 못했던 곳.
그게 다른 세상인 건 맞긴 맞아, 그치?
네.
You've never been before. 가본 적이 없는 곳으로 데려다 수 있는. They help us explore our world. We have books here on just about every subject you can think of. This is the fiction section. Does anyone know the difference between fiction and non-fiction books? Non-fiction books are books that are not fiction, Ryan said, because non means not, like non-fat milk has no fat in it, and nonsense has no sense in it. Michael added, that's true. 똑띠들이네. Mrs. Roopy said, but there's a little more to it. Fiction is what you get when you rub two things together, I said. 뭐라고? Everybody laughed, even though I didn't say anything funny. That's friction, AJ, Andrea, Young. Friction이 뭔지 알겠어?
네.
야,
알아요.
두 개를 비볐을 때. Andrea Young said, fiction is a made-up story, and non-fiction is based on facts. 아이고, 똑똑한 아이들이 많네. That's correct, said Mrs. Roopy. 근데 너희들 이렇게 진짜 많이 말했어. 옛날에 그런 것도 있었어. 불길해요. 자꾸 불길해요. 했는데 그게 불리해요. 놀이터에서 놀 때. 1, 2학년 고맘 때. 그런 말들이 되게 많았어. 그래서 영어 철자를 달달달달달 지금 외우는 거는 아무 의미가 없다. 많이 말해보고 틀려보고 읽어보고 틀려보고 막 많이 틀려보는 식이야. 정확하게 배우는 식이가 아니라.
나도.
Oh, 아니구나. That's correct, Mrs.Roopy said, and she smiled at Andrea. I wished 뒤에는 뭐가 나오는지 딱 신경 써서 봐야 돼. Wished Andrea would. Shut up.
그럼
would.
절대로 shut 안 한단 말이.
If I were, I would. 요거랑 I wish랑 똑같은 거야. 그냥 희망하는 게 아니야.
I will shut up.
Who cares what the difference between fiction and non-fiction is? 이것도 우리 하는 what it is 패턴인 게 눈에 보여야 됩니다.
네.
I said, all books are boring. Everybody went, ooh, like I had said something really terrible. But everybody needs to know how to read, AJ, Mrs.Roopy said. Not me, I said. When I grow up, I am going to be a trick bike rider because trick bike. 아빠 또 소리 내면서 나오겠네. Not me, I said. When I grow up, I'm going to be a trick bike rider because you don't have to know how to read to do tricks on a bike. Football player 된다고 했다가 또 뭐 있었지? 또 딴 거 있었는데? Football player에서 모르겠다.
하기.
하키? 어.
ballet.
이제 trick bike rider. Yeah, me too. Said Michael and Ryan. We told Mrs.Roopy that every day after school, me and Michael and Ryan ride our bikes together. I learned how to ride a two-wheeler in kindergarten. Do you remember when you learned how to ride?
나보다 진짜. 나보다 좋다. AJ.
언니 자전거는 되게 일찍 탔어. 이사간 친구 누구지? 유준이? 모르겠네. 그 친구가 진짜 자전거를 빨리 탔거든.
몇 살?
6살 때. 6살 때 두 발 자전거 탄 애들은 잘 없어. 근데 걔가 타는 거 보더니 니도 갑자기 타더라. Anyway, said Mrs. Roopy, he invented the number system we used to find books in the library. If it weren't for Melville the way, we would never be able to find anything. We will not be able to. 너도 if weren't would. 톡톡 눈에 들어가야 돼요.
네.
이 if의 2번이 초 3, 4가 보는 책에 나오잖아. 어려운 말 아님. 맞지? 이건 중3 문법도 아님.
네.
무슨 문법을 체계적으로 배우려고 이거를 미루고 중3 때 배우고도 못하냐. 중3 때 배우진 않는다. 그 중3 문법을 땡겨 배우긴 하는데 공식으로 배우지. 초5 때. 초5면은 중등 문법을 해야 된다고 얘기를 하거든. 근데 초5 때 안 해도 돼. 니 초1 때 했잖아. 참 방법이 잘못된 거에 대해서는 사람들이 인정을 안 해. 방법이 잘못된 건데. 이게 뭐가 어렵지? 맞지?
이 방법을 좋아하는 사람은 subscribe.
이 문법을 초5면 해야 된다는 게 아니라 한국식 문법. 그건 문법이 아니야. 한국식 문법을 보면은 문법이 아니야. 한국식 문법, 미국식 문법이 달라서 될 말이가? 그냥 알아는 법칙이야. 내가 너라면 난 그렇게 안 한다. 나 같으면 그렇게 안 한다. 이거를 중3 문법으로 구분 짓고 공식으로 배울 말이 아니잖아, 그치?
네.
나 진짜 이해가 안 된다. Something is wrong이다.
You?
참 아이들이 많이 고생하거든, 그렇게 공부하면. 그렇게 어렵게 고생하는데 엄마들은 되게 좋아해. 진짜 공부하는 것처럼 보이거든. 아휴. Anyway, 나도 네가 없었으면 그렇게 수업했을 거야. 그게 쉽게 돈 버는 방법이거든.